The quality of persistence is in some ways the most mysterious quality that all superachievers share. Mysterious because it's the one quality that almost all successful people agree on. And yet probably the quality that simultaneously receives the most ridicule. People criticize Dick Vermeil for returning to coaching after so many years to coach the St. Louis Rams. Yet, after persisting through 2 miserable seasons and mountains of criticism, the Rams won the Super Bowl in his 3rd year. Likewise, people criticized Colonel Sanders when he received over 1,000 rejections from restaurant owners for his chicken recipe. Yet a few rejections later, he found a taker. The rest is history. As Brian Tracy says in this next session, the key to success is to set a goal and stay with it until you achieve your success at one important thing. Brian Tracy is a leading authority on the development of human potential and personal effectiveness. He's also the author-narrator of several Nightingale Conant bestsellers, including The Psychology of Achievement, The Psychology of Selling, and The Luck Factor. Listen and learn about this important quality of persistence as Brian recounts his incredible experiences during his trek across the Sahara Desert. Here's Brian's famous message: success is a journey.
Thank you. I can't tell you how delighted I am to be here. Did you ever stop and ask yourself, why is it that some people are more successful than others? Why is it that some people make more money, live longer, have better relationships, while the great mass of men, as Thoreau said, live lives of quiet desperation? When I was 15, I set out on a lifelong journey to find the answer to that question. Why are some people more successful than others? You see, when I was growing up, my family never seemed to have enough money. My parents grew up during the Depression, and I heard the same things over and over again throughout my childhood. We can't afford it. We can't afford it. We can't afford it. I don't know if you heard that when you were growing up. It seemed to be the national anthem. I was not a great student. I passed out of high school when I was 18. I say passed out because, rather than graduated, because that's what happened. I passed out in the half of the class that made the top half possible. The person in front of me, and there's a lot of people out here in the same half, the person in front of me on the stage and the person in back of me received diplomas, and I got a leaving certificate. When you open it up, it says, goodbye. And that's what they meant, goodbye, don't ever come back. Anyway, since then I've traveled and worked in more than 80 countries on 6 continents. I've sailed on all the great oceans. I've been around the world 2 or 3 times. I became fluent in French, German, and Spanish, as well as learning to get along in several other languages. When you need to eat, you learn. Anyway, I started off as poor as I could be, searching for the secrets of success. And over the years, I've read and studied for over 30,000 hours in business, economics, psychology, philosophy, religion, metaphysics, and history to find the secrets of success. And I'm happy to say that I eventually found the answers I was looking for. Today, I live in a $1 million house on a golf course in Southern California, and I have business interests in 9 countries. Today, I know and I've proven that success in any field, including this field, is as predictable as the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. And my purpose in speaking with you today is to share with you some of the most important things I've ever learned. However, as Aristotle once said, you can't teach a person something that they don't already know. You're already high achievers and great successes in your careers. You're already the cream of your profession. So many of you already know what we're going to talk about, and the rest of you will recognize these principles as soon as you hear them. About 5 years ago, I met a wise and wealthy man who had spent his entire life studying success. And he'd reached a clear conclusion concerning the reason for success in life and especially in business. He's dead now, but I'll never forget what he told me, because I immediately recognized that he'd put the finger on my reason for success and yours, as we'll talk about in a minute. He said the key to success was to set a goal and then to stay with it until you achieve success in at least one important thing. He said that your subconscious mind will then accept that success experience and store it as a pattern, like a template. And then from then on, your subconscious will drive you and direct you and guide you to repeat the pattern of success in other things that you attempt. Another way of saying it is that nothing succeeds like success. Psychologists have demonstrated that achievement brings you a natural high. Once you've experienced your first great success, then not only are you unconsciously programmed to repeat it, but nothing else will ever give you the same wonderful sense of satisfaction. And all high achievers know that. Anyway, I learned the truth of this idea many years ago when I first started traveling. I spent 8 years traveling around the world. And in many ways, a trip or a journey is a metaphor for life. My first big trip was that, and much, much more. It had such an enormous impact on me that I've never really gotten over it. My whole life has been different as a result of what I call the Sahara crossing. Let me tell you about it. When I was 18, 3 friends and I decided we'd go off and see the world. We were well out of high school, and we were laboring in sawmills on the West Coast. This is in 1963, and a lot of our friends were heading for Europe to travel around with backpacks. So we decided to do something different. You see, nobody else was going to Africa, so we decided we'd go to Africa. Of course, it never occurred to us to ask why it was that no one else was going to Africa. And that was our first mistake. After working and saving for a year, the 4 of us piled into an old 1946 Chevy and drove out of Vancouver, bound for Montreal via Toronto. Actually, we just passed a couple of blocks from here on our way on that trip. It was late at night when we left. It was pouring rain. We were all 20 years old, and we were off to see the world. Anyway, I learned later that almost every great venture begins with an act of faith, like driving into the dark, into the unknown. In a way, nature protects us by shielding us from knowledge of the difficulties and obstacles that lie ahead. Because if we really knew all the problems we would face, the setbacks, the suffering, the temporary failure, and the disappointments, many of us would hesitate about ever even starting out at all. And then our plan was to drive across country to Montreal, get jobs on ships to work our way across the Atlantic, and then head south across Europe to Africa. Pretty basic plan. However, as it happened in Montreal, one of the guys decided to give up and go home, and so he left us. Well, that left 3. The other 2, after one day, I still remember that, after one day of looking for work on the waterfront, decided to quit. Decided to quit trying and to spend their limited savings to pay their way across the Atlantic rather than to work their way. I tried to talk them out of it. I told them that quitting is a habit. If you quit the first time you run into difficulties, you'll always quit when the going gets rough. You will, in effect, establish a pattern for failure rather than a pattern for success. But their minds were made up, so we split our savings and they took passage on a ship to England. I worked on a construction site in Montreal, hauling heavy things for the entire winter, and then I got a job on a Norwegian freighter out of Halifax in late February and arrived in England in mid-April. As I had predicted, my friends had quit and stayed in England working at odd jobs. However, we soon made up, good buddies again, and once more we headed for Africa. At this time, all we had was an 8.5 by 11-inch page about this size that had Europe and Africa all on the same map, on the same page. And it seemed to be a very simple thing to go from London, which was up here, to Johannesburg, which was down here. It was just one page. And I mean, we sort of drew a straight line, and we thought, well, oh yes, there was a little orange part right across sort of a band right through the middle there called the Sahara Desert. But we thought, well, we'd just whip over that and get down to the green part on the map. There's no problem. I'm without a word of a lie, this is true. We didn't stop to think that the total distance was about 8,000 miles. See, we were big picture people. We didn't let ourselves get bogged down with details. We were young and we hadn't learned that it's the details that get you every single time. So we took a train down to London. There we bought bicycles. See, we'd never heard of anyone riding from London to Johannesburg on bicycles, so we decided that we would do it first and become famous. That was another mistake. We soon learned that when you ride bicycles across France in the springtime, you find that the hills are all uphill and the wind is always in your face. So likewise, I found that when you embark on any new venture, you often find the same thing. Everything seems to go wrong, usually at the worst possible time and in the worst possible and most expensive way, like starting a new business or a new career. Anyway, after 2 weeks of grinding along on bicycles uphill the whole way, which seems like a geographical impossibility, but it's true, we said, the heck with this. We loaded the bikes on a train and we rode across France and Spain to Gibraltar. There we sold the bicycles and bought a Land Rover with our last dollar. We had definitely learned why no one had ever crossed Africa on bicycles. It was darn near impossible to cross France on bicycles. Europe on bicycles. Anyway, so now we had a little problem. We were out of money. We'd exhausted our meager finances buying the Land Rover, and we didn't have enough money for fuel and equipment. So we all sat down. We considered ourselves great writers at that time. We all sat down and wrote letters to everybody that we knew, pleading for money, telling them how desperate our situation was. Sitting here looking across the Straits of Gibraltar to Africa. All we needed was just a little bit of money to get us over there. Anyway, eventually we got a little bit of money here and a little bit of money there, and then we got one big score. I'll never forget this. An uncle of Jeff's that he'd only seen once in his life sent us 100 pounds. 100 pounds at that time was $300, worth more than $1,000 today. And we were ecstatic. We were saved. So this was another lesson. Nobody ever makes it on their own. One of the great lessons of life. We all need help from others to get over the rough spots on the journey of life. Well, with the additional money, we loaded up with food and supplies. We took the ferry over to Tangiers in Morocco, and then we headed out of Tangiers toward the Atlas Mountains and the Sahara, full of excitement, singing as we drove down the road. 20 miles out, the radiator blew up. The Land Rover had never been driven on the open road. It had spent its whole working life tooling around the narrow streets of Gibraltar, and once on the open road, it began to fall apart. The radiator was just the beginning. Over the next 10 days, the steering rods bent and threw the front wheels out of alignment, so the tires blew one by one. We had trouble with the carburetor and the ignition system. We were so poorly equipped, if you can believe it, we didn't even have a jack or a lug wrench. When we got a flat tire, and we got lots of flat tires, we had to sit by the side of the road patiently, sometimes for hours, until somebody came along with the proper tools to help us change the tire. But we pressed on anyway. As we drove deeper into Morocco and over the Atlas Mountains and onto the Sahara Escarpment, we entered into a world that had changed very little in 1,000 years. There were long, long stretches of barren country roads and an occasional oasis surrounded by primitive farms, which was irrigated from wells and underground rivers. And that began an experience that I still remember quite clearly, and I think you'll be able to relate to this. By this time, I was speaking French fairly well. We could converse with the natives in the occasional small towns that we passed through. And in one town, early in our slow, halting trek across Morocco, someone asked us where we were headed. And we told them that we were going across the Sahara and into Africa. And he said, "Oh, no." He said, "You can't do that." He said, "You'll die in the desert." Well, I looked up my dictionary quickly because I didn't understand the expression. Vous allez mourir dans le Wust. Vous allez mourir dans le Wust. Okay? Vous allez, you will die in the desert. We then began to hear this on a regular basis everywhere we went. We'd stop in a small town, and people would bring their friends up to us and introduce us as the young men who were going off to die in the desert. Well, they seemed quite cheerful about it, but after a while, we found it kind of irritating. I mean, and by the way, these were not your average Arabs. These were Bedouin and Tuareg. These were desert people, members of tribes that lived in the Sahara for 1,000 years. I mean, they were in a position to know what they were talking about. And I learned a valuable lesson from this. I learned then, and for the rest of your life, whenever you try to do something out of the ordinary, people will line up to tell you that you can't do it, why you can't do it, that you'll lose your time, you'll lose your money, that you will, in effect, die in the desert. Even people who should know better will try to discourage you. To achieve anything greater worthwhile, you must train yourself to rise above these people, ignoring them and pressing on towards your goal regardless. Geez, you're great guys. I love it. We crossed from Morocco into Algeria and drove south to the town of Adrar on the edge of the Sahara. By this time, our vehicle was falling apart. And with the cost of repairs and gasoline and food, we'd almost run out of money again. One of the guys, sick from dysentery, decided to give up. He took his money and his belongings and he hitchhiked to the Mediterranean, 500 miles north and then back to England. That left two of us. We began wondering, what are we doing here? We were two young men, 20 and 21 years of age, thousands of miles from home, sick, tired, and almost broke, with thousands of miles ahead of us. We couldn't even remember why we started out in the first place, except that we had set it as a goal. And we were too dumb to change it. Anyway, but one of the things that kept us going was a book of poetry by Robert W. Service. Robert W. Service had driven an ambulance in World War I, and he'd written poetry to cheer up the soldiers in the trenches on the Western Front. And there was one poem that we read over and over. It always gave us a boost in the determination to go forward, and it was called Carry On. And it started like this. It said, "It's easy to fight when everything's right, when you're mad with the thrill and the glory. It's easy to cheer when victory is near and wallow in fields that are gory. It's a different song when everything's wrong, when you're feeling infernally mortal, when it's 10 against 1 and hope there is none. Buck up, little soldier, and chortle. Carry on, there isn't much punch in your blow. You're glaring and staring and hitting out blinds. You're muddy and bloody, but never you mind. Carry on. You haven't the ghost of a show. It's looking like death, but while you've a breath, carry on, my son, carry on." Well, by this time we were in the Sahara, the largest desert on Earth. It stretches across the Tropic of Capricorn from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea, more than 5,000 miles. And the part that we faced, dead ahead, was the Tenerife, the emptiest single stretch of the Sahara, 500 miles of nothing, not a fly, not a blade of grass, as flat as a tabletop. 500 miles. The enormity of what we had embarked on finally began to sink in. We learned that more than 1,300 people had perished in the Tenerife in the last 20 years. 42 vehicles had broken down in the desert, and many of their drivers were never seen again alive. By this time, Jeff and I were once more out of money. All our tires were scraped bald and they needed to be replaced. We needed additional tanks so we could carry enough gas and water for the crossing. We needed tools to do repairs. We needed a jack and lug wrench so that we could change tires. Obvious. For 3 weeks, we stayed in a drawer. Jeff hitchhiked north to Algiers to wire for more money, more creative writing, while I sold all our supplies except for a bare minimum. With that money and by stripping abandoned vehicles, I got the Land Rover repaired and properly outfitted with reasonably good tires, a reserve gas tank, proper tools, and supplies for the crossing. It's amazing how enterprising you become when your survival is at stake. By the way, this story took place 24 years ago today. Imagine. The Sahara Desert in June is hot. How hot is it? It's very hot. It's damn hot. At midday, it reaches 140 degrees Fahrenheit. An exposed man can die of dehydration in less than 20 minutes. When the French ran Algeria, they required travelers to carry 5 gallons of water per person per day for the crossing. That's how much you drank. Because of the heat, you can only travel before 10 a.m. and after 4 p.m. The midday sun is so hot that if you drive, your engine oil boils. It becomes as thin as water, and your vehicle seizes up and it'll never run again. 6 weeks after crossing from Gibraltar, we were ready. Jeff came back with some money from his parents, and the vehicle was in perfect condition for the crossing. We realized that if anything did go wrong and we couldn't fix it, we would most certainly die in the desert. 3 days before the big push, the actual crossing, we met 5 Germans in a Volkswagen bus who were waiting for a truck convoy that would cross in a few days. They were going to play it safe and cross with the convoy, safety in numbers. We told them we were going convoy or no convoy, and they decided to cross with us. The Algerian government stamps your passport out of Algeria 500 miles north of the border. From there on, you're on your own, and they couldn't care less what happens to you. As far as they're concerned, you don't exist anymore. So we set out, and I remember this clearly, we set out at sunset on a Thursday following La Piste, which is a French word for track, a very accurate word, track, that led straight south across the desert. We drove through the night. As we drove through the night, about 50 miles out, our troubles began. The Germans' vehicle sunk in and started to get bogged down in the fine sand that had blown over the track. And it also began to break down mechanically. It started getting sand in the carburetor and everything, and it began to delay us hour by hour. We had to get across the 500 miles in 2 days, or we'd be out of water. So we pressed on as fast as we could. But over and over, the German vehicle got stuck, and we had to stop and drag it out with our four-wheel drive Land Rover, losing time and using precious fuel. Jeff and I took turns driving the Land Rover while the German vehicle drove parallel with us across the flat wasteland. And we kept ourselves motivated by quoting the poem, Carry On, back and forth to each other. And the next verse goes like this: and so in the strife of the battle of life, it's easy to fight when you're winning. It's easy to slave and starve and be brave when the dawn of success is beginning. But the man who can meet despair and defeat with a cheer, there's the man of God's choosing. The man who can fight to heaven's own height is the man who can fight when he's losing. Carry on, things never were looming so black. But show that you haven't a cowardly streak, and though you're unlucky, you never are weak. Carry on, brace up for another attack. It's looking like hell, but you never can tell. Carry on, old man, carry on. By morning, we had only made 150 miles, and we were all exhausted and a bit tense. There was an abandoned army fort in the middle of the desert, and we had hoped to shelter there from the midday sun in one of the empty buildings, and now it was too late. The sun had begun its implacable climb up the eastern sky. Still, we hurried on. So fortunately, you couldn't get lost crossing the Sahara in the daytime. The track across the desert is marked by black 55-gallon oil drums located every 5 kilometers, which is exactly the curve of the Earth's surface. You can always, as you drive, you can always see 2 oil barrels, the one you've just passed and the one you're heading for. So all you have to do to cross the biggest desert on Earth is to take it 1 oil barrel at a time. Of course, traveling at night, if you wander from La Piste, if you wander from the track, you can get lost in the desert and drive until you run out of gas. And many people have died that way. As we would approach each oil barrel, it was really neat. As we approach each oil barrel, we come to this oil barrel, we just come parallel with it. The next oil barrel would just pop up on the horizon. And as we would pass this oil barrel, the one behind us would fall off the horizon, as though it had been shot in a shooting gallery. Really, really neat. So in the years since then, I found that you can achieve almost any goal you set for yourself if you simply take it 1 oil barrel, 1 step at a time. If you go as far as you can see, you will then see far enough to go further. Now the sun really became the enemy. It sat on the horizon like a big, evil, yellow cat, and then it began to rise inexorably, getting hotter and hotter as we raced south. The temperature grew hotter and hotter. Finally, at 9:30 a.m., it reached 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and the vehicles began coughing and stalling. We signaled between the two vehicles and agreed to stop and wait out the heat, right there in the middle of that 25,000 square mile parking lot. You never felt so small in your entire life. I'll never forget that day. Hour after hour, we sat in our vehicles like sitting in a bake oven, prostrate from the pounding heat of the sun that reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit by noon and seemed to stay there forever. We drank quart after quart of water, our throats going bone dry minutes after gulping down a full canteen. It was worse outside, so we just stayed in the vehicles and suffered hour after hour. Finally, as the afternoon wore on, the temperature slowly began to fall. By 4 p.m., it was down to 105 degrees. When it finally got below 100 degrees Fahrenheit at 5 p.m., we started on. But now we were racing the clock. We only made about 200 miles in the last almost 24, and we still had 300 miles to go. There's a small oasis, an army post on the other side of the Tenerife, and we knew we had to get there before the midday sun caught us again. We hadn't slept since Thursday morning. It was now Friday evening. We pushed on over the desert, but the Germans' vehicle kept breaking down. All night, exhausted, we worked to get the Volkswagen bus with the Germans across to the other side. We were both desperate and scared. We knew that we could not last another day. Our water was almost gone. When the sun rose slowly on Saturday morning, we were still struggling with the Germans' vehicle. Finally, at 9 a.m., with 20 miles to go, their vehicle broke down for the last time. We quickly abandoned it. We loaded the 5 Germans in the back of a Land Rover and headed for the fort and the oasis. An oasis, by the way, is a place where there's one well with a bucket. That's an oasis. It was further than we thought, but we made it just before the heat forced us to stop. We were all aware of how close we had come to actually dying in the desert. Those Arabs knew what they were talking about. So we sat out the heat that day in a native hut near the fort, and then we went back that evening and towed the Volkswagen bus into the army post. We had done it. We were over the Sahara. We hadn't slept for... We hadn't slept for 2.5 days, but we had made it. Now, I won't go into the details of what happened on the rest of our trip across Africa, except to say that we did finally get to Johannesburg 2 or 3 months later. I won't trouble you with how we had to cross 2 countries illegally with the police and the army on orders to shoot to kill if they saw us. And I won't go into how we were almost killed under the boots and rifle butts of a mob of soldiers in the Congo. That was another close one. And I won't talk here about the experience of meeting and working with Dr. Albert Schweitzer in his hospital village in Lambrini. You know, I'll wrap up this story here by telling you what I learned about life and success in the Sahara crossing. Here are 7 rules you can apply to any challenge that you face in achieving anything you desire. Rule number 1, the most important key to achieving great success is to decide upon your goal and then launch. Get started, take action, do something, move. A 12-year study at Babson College concluded that the act of taking the first step is what separates the losers from the winners, or the winners from the losers. We set out at the age of 20 with $300 each to cross 3 continents and travel 17,000 miles from Vancouver on the west coast to Johannesburg in southern Africa. And we made it in just under 12 months. But the most important step was the first one. All the rest followed from that. Number 2, once you've launched towards your goal, never consider the possibility of failure. The Germans have a saying, it's immer vorne, nie zurück. Immer vorne, nie zurück. And it means always forward, never backward. Always forward, never backward. Never consider the possibility of failure. Every person here is here because they refused to quit when the going got rough. Your ability to persist in the face of setbacks and disappointments is vital to all great achievement, and it's always a decision that you make. It's not the external environment, it's always the internal environment. Number 3, the biggest goal in the world can be accomplished if you just take it 1 oil barrel at a time. Thomas Carlyle once wrote that our great business is not to see what lies dimly at a distance, but to do what lies clearly at hand. The only time you will ever have is now. If you live every day, every hour, the best you can, the rest will take care of itself. As the Bible says, sufficient unto the day are the cares thereof. Number 4, watch out for the naysayers. The negative people around you are always telling you that you'll die in the desert. Get around positive people. Get around winners like people in this room. Fly with the eagles and refuse to listen to objections and reasons why you can't succeed. Someone once said that if every possible objection must first be overcome, nothing will ever get done. And truer words were never spoken. Number 5, welcome obstacles and difficulties as valuable and inevitable steps on the ladder of success. Remember that difficulties come not to obstruct, but to instruct. Difficulties come not to obstruct, but to instruct. Our trip to Africa was one problem after another. We ran out of money over and over. We strained every muscle of our bodies trying to ride bicycles across France and Spain. Our Land Rover broke down again and again. We suffered from dysentery and heat stroke and exhaustion. But when it was time, we were ready for the Sahara crossing. In retrospect, we saw clearly that without the lessons that we had learned from our mistakes, we would have surely died in the desert. And when you look back on any achievement, you will find it was preceded by many difficulties and many lessons. They are the price that you pay for your success, and no success is possible without them. Number 6, be clear about your goal, but be flexible about the process of achieving it. Be willing to change, to try something new. Keep your mind open and fluid and flexible. Be willing to accept feedback from your environment and correct your course. This is a key quality of peak performers. They're not rigid, they're flexible. Remember, it's not what you have, but what you do with what you have that separates winners from losers. It's not what happens to you, but how you respond to what happens to you that counts. In the final analysis, your response to the adversity of life is the real measure of who you are and what you're made of. The Greek philosopher Epictetus once said that circumstances do not make the man or woman, they merely reveal him to himself. When you find out who you really are when you face adversity. And remember, number 7, the last rule is nobody does it alone. At every step on our journey across Africa, people helped us with advice and with food and with assistance and with money, but especially with warmth and with kindness and with generosity. When life is over, it will be the people that we lived and laughed and loved with that we remember more than anything else. So don't be afraid to ask for help from others. It's a mark of strength and courage and character. And don't be reluctant to give of yourself to others generously. It's the mark of caring and compassion and personal greatness. The reason the Sahara story was so relevant for me was that because after the Sahara, I never felt that there was anything I couldn't do. I felt programmed for success for life, although it took me many years to understand it. And the reason why this story may be of interest to you is because I believe that everyone has a Sahara to cross, perhaps more than one. Many of you are crossing your own Saharas right now. Everyone eventually goes through periods of great difficulty, their own private hells, their dark nights of the soul. But it is by facing whatever life gives us with courage and determination that we grow more surely toward the stars. Let me leave you with the last verse of Carry On. There are some who drift out in the deserts of doubt, and some who in negativity wallow. There are others I know who in piety go because of a heaven to follow. But to labor with zest and to give of your best for the sweetness and joy of the giving, to help folks along with a hand and a song, why there's the real sunshine of living. Carry on, fight the good fight and true. There's big work to do. Believe in your mission, greet life with a cheer. There's big work to do, and that's why you're here. Carry on, let the world be the better for you. So at last when you die, let this be your cry. Carry on, my soul, carry on. Ladies and gentlemen, if you will resolve with whatever life hands you to carry on, there is nothing that can stop you from achieving the greatness for which you were created. Thank you. God bless you.
This is the end of Side 7. Please fast forward the tape to the end to cue up Side 8 for your listening. Captain Gerald Coffey is no stranger to the concept of persistence. As a prisoner of war for 7 years in Vietnam, Gerald endured torturous conditions that are totally repugnant to anyone's sense of human decency. However, from Gerald's perspective, these very conditions were the catalyst to developing his physical, mental, and spiritual capacities far beyond what he could have ever imagined before. Listen as Captain Gerald Coffey recounts his amazing story of persistence in this powerful speech, Free to Dream.
Thank you very much, Jack, and thank you for that welcome. To have been a prisoner of war all that time is a rather dubious distinction, I think. I would have considered myself more successful to have survived that deployment that I was on and have come back and deployed several more times, flown the combat missions that my contemporaries did, and to make my contribution in that way. However, that wasn't to be the case, and I found myself fighting my own kind of war in a different way, in a different place. Because it happened so long ago, I don't think it does us any good to dwell upon the experience per se. It's more important, I think, considering the problems that we face in the present and the immediate future, to dwell upon those things of the present and the future, and only those things of the past by which we can learn important lessons. So I'm not here today to tell you in so many words what it was like to be a prisoner of war there, much in the same way that I debriefed my intelligence officer upon my return. It's more important, I think, to relate to you the most important lessons that I learned, the lessons which contributed the most to my survival and to that of my contemporaries there during all those years. And not only that, but how those very same lessons have served me so well since I've been home and will continue to. And lastly, I hope to explain to you and to give you some insight into how it was so much more than just my experience alone, but that of yours as well. Every single one of you, individually, experienced this with me and with my friends there. And perhaps that will become more apparent as we go along also. This experience of ours, yours and mine, began in February of 1966. I was flying a reconnaissance mission off the decks of the USS Kitty Hawk in the Tonkin Gulf. I was launched on the last launch of the last day on the line before the carrier was supposed to go into Hong Kong for 10 days of liberty. And that was one of my greatest regrets. But you can be sure I've since made up for that. My aircraft was hit by small arms fire, and the hit itself wasn't so tremendous, but it severed the hydraulic lines of the aircraft, spilling all the hydraulic fluid, thereby precluding my ability to steer. The engines were working great, and as soon as we took the hit, I turned the aircraft toward the sea to get as far out as possible to enhance our chances of rescue. I accelerated, went into burner, and the airplane did accelerate. However, as we were going across the beach, the control stick froze in my hand, and the airplane began to roll, and it continued to roll and went more and more rapidly with the nose dropping toward the horizon, and it became apparent to me that my crewman and I wouldn't be able to stay with the airplane. So I yelled to my crewman over the intercom, "Eject, eject, eject." I didn't hear him go, so I reached up and pulled my own face curtain, which automatically ejects him first, and then myself a split second later. Because by that time we had accelerated to about 680 miles per hour, I was knocked unconscious immediately. And for all practical purposes, had I never regained consciousness, I would have died then. And many of my friends used to say, instead of when I was shot down, they would say, when I was killed, because it was so close to the same thing. I regained consciousness 10 or 15 minutes later, I'm not really sure how long, floating in the water about a quarter of a mile off the coast. Unconsciously, due to the repetition of my training, I had released my parachute my oxygen mask, deployed my survival kit, and inflated my flotation gear, all subconsciously, without realizing it, with a broken arm, dislocated elbow and shoulder, and many cuts and burns and bruises. My crewman was about 50 yards away, already inflating his life raft. And there were several boats full of North Vietnamese coming out toward us, shooting in the water around us and over our heads. And there were no aircraft overhead. And it appeared to us that escape was simply out of the question. And it was. Very shortly, the first boat pulled up alongside of me and very roughly pulled me inside and began stripping me of my survival gear. And just then, 2 of our own aircraft did finally show up overhead. And not realizing that we were in those boats, they began rolling in on strafing patterns with the machine gun bullets bracketing our boats once across the bow. And I could remember pulling myself up and watching those planes rolling in as the bullets would bracket the bow and then the stern and then the bow and the stern. Finally, after 6 or 7 passes, they broke it off, realizing that we had in fact been picked up by the boats. As soon as we reached the shore, we jumped out on the breaker line and ran across a very wide expanse of beach and dove behind a rice paddy dike, just as another aircraft rolled in and fired a pack of rockets and blew those boats to splinters. Sometime during the battle for our capture that day, my crewman, my friend, was killed. I'm not really sure how. He was either killed by our own aircraft strafing or by the Vietnamese out of excitement or revenge, or his boat was sunk. But I never saw him again. And that was my introduction to North Vietnam. Well, our trip to Hanoi took about 6 or 7 days because we were very far south in the country of North Vietnam. And we traveled by a Russian-built Jeep-like vehicle across very ruddy, bombed-out roads. We forded rivers and went across pontoon bridges because most of the regular bridges had been bombed. And during that trip, every time we made a stop at a hamlet or some group of buildings, I would convince myself that we had arrived at the POW compound in which I was to be kept. And all that time I was looking for that classic case, such as the POW compound that you may recall from that old World War II movie, Stalag 17, or the TV series, Hogan's Heroes, you know, where the guard's kind of a roly-poly guy and they laugh and scratch, and the guys sit around and they have mouse races and bet cigarettes and play the guitar a little bit and some volleyball. That's not too bad. Can last out the war at that rate. So when we reached the capital city of Hanoi and pulled up in front of that huge fortress-like prison called Hoa Lo, and Hoa Lo in Vietnamese means fiery forge. It was named by the Vietnamese themselves, by their treatment that they received under the French there during the days of colonialism. I was taken through those big iron gates of Hoa Lo prison and down the corridors into my first cell, shoved very roughly inside, and the heavy wooden door slammed behind me and the iron bolt clanked home with a note of finality. And I looked around and couldn't believe where I found myself. I was in a tiny cell about the size of a single bed. There was a concrete slab on one side coming out of the wall about 18 inches wide, and that was to be my bed, at the foot of which was a set of ankle stocks, wooden on the bottom, and a heavy iron bar that came down across the top with a large padlock. There was one window very high in the cell with a double row of iron bars through which all I could see was the top of that 18-foot wall which surrounded the entire city block-sized prison, shards of broken glass embedded in the concrete on top and strands of barbed wire above that. There was one small can in the corner of the cell that was supposed to take care of all my physical needs. And the cell just reeked of the human misery, the decades of human misery that had been there before me. And I think the first thought that might have gone through my mind was something like, hey babe, this ain't the Navy that you shipped over for, you know, and indeed it wasn't. Because, like every naval aviator flying from the decks of an aircraft carrier, it always happens to the other guy. Although we're prepared, it's going to happen to someone else, not me. Well, that period of initial adjustment there where the realization of my plight really began to sink in, that in fact I had been captured and that I was a prisoner of war. And those initial interrogations and torture sessions were intense. Sometimes when you'd only have time to come back to your cell and sort of lick your wounds and take a big breath and get ready for the time that you knew was sure to come when those keys would rattle outside your door at the wrong time of the night again. That was a very difficult time. And you can be sure that I prayed a lot. At first, as I recall, my prayers were kind of futile. I remember saying something like, God, if you just give me those last 5 minutes to fly over again, you can be sure I'd fly somewhere else for starters. Or futile like, God, please get me out of here as soon as possible. Get me home to my loved ones, to my country, Lord. I don't really care how. Let there be a military victory, a political settlement, a POW exchange. God, I don't care how, but please let it be soon. I don't know how long I can endure this. And honestly, if at that time I had realized that it was going to be for 7 years and 9 days, I don't know what I would have done. As I would pray, the realization of the futility of those prayers began to sink in. And I would say to myself, this just isn't going to do. And finally, my prayers took a new turn. A new turn to sound something like, okay, God, if this is the way it's going to be, for however long, then God, help me to make it count for something positive. It has the potential, if you will, to be my personal dark ages of this period of time, however long. Help me instead to turn it around to my personal renaissance. God, help me to learn something new every day, to emerge from this experience a better man in every way that I can. Help me to go home a better American, a better citizen, a better officer, a better husband and father, a better friend to all of my friends. God, help me to make it count for something positive. Well, after that point, which I consider a turning point in my prayers, and in comparing notes with my friends there at later times, we all reach that point sooner or later. My life took on a new meaning, for indeed, every day there was something to accomplish, something new to learn, and it helped the time go faster because we had confidence that we weren't living in a vacuum, but something was being accomplished, indeed. And as I would pace back and forth in my cell there in those early days, taking 3 steps in turn, and I've developed quite an empathy for lions and tigers that I see in the zoo pacing back and forth in their cage. Walking several miles a day at that rate, I would dwell upon the fact that when I returned, and although sometimes it was difficult, I never thought that I wouldn't, when I returned there would be opportunities just like this. Opportunities to share that experience, the things that I had learned, how I'd survived. And I would ask myself at that time, what are you going to say? How can you keep from blowing this opportunity, which may last 20 or 30 minutes at the most? What are you going to share? And the entire time I was in prison, I didn't know what the answer to that question was. And I didn't know until I returned home in February of 1973. And when I returned, I found a very different country, a different America, a different society, a different world in so many ways. And if you'll project yourselves back to that period between 1966 and 73 and think about your own changes in your family, your community, the changes that you saw in our nation. We were still suffering from the trauma of Vietnam, and it was to get worse when South Vietnam fell. It was almost as if we could foresee the problems of Watergate coming upon us. Our society had become so complex. And it finally occurred to me that the same key to my survival there in prison during those years would serve me well on a daily basis at home in America. And the key to that survival was faith. Faith. Not just spiritual faith, that of course, but first of all, faith in myself as an individual to hack it, to gut it out, to last as long as I was going to have to. Faith in the men around me, my fellow man, if you will, in the fellow Americans, the Vietnamese, my fellow Americans and family at home. Faith in my country, America, the principles upon which it's founded, which have made it endure, and faith in God, in my God. And I'd like to share with you how those aspects of faith served me so well in prison and do on a continuing basis right here at home. First of all, faith in ourselves as individuals. Faith in ourselves to adjust and to accept that new situation. Faith in ourselves to resist the exploitation, the efforts of the enemy to extract military information and propaganda through writing letters or making tapes or encouraging other prisoners newly shot down to cooperate with the prison authorities. Faith in ourselves to minimize the net gain that the enemy could receive by having us at his total mercy. Keeping faith in ourselves to stay fit physically by walking those several miles a day, keeping our muscle tone up, doing push-ups, sit-ups, deep breathing exercises, you name it, anything to maintain the muscle tone, to be ready to face whatever might come around the corner the next day, whether it be a forced march to China or more torture. Keeping faith in ourselves to stay alive mentally, not letting our minds and brains atrophy. And we developed several means of doing this. Memory work was one of the primary ways of staying busy and active mentally. We memorized the books of the Bible and the capitals of the states all alphabetically. There was one time when I had memorized over 450 names of other American prisoners that I'd received through our communication system there. And I would go over them every other day or so, all alphabetically, and I had 27 A's or 35 B's and 42 C's, and maybe I'd only come up with 41 C's that one day, go back over my C's to make sure I didn't drop that one. Because if I should have an opportunity to escape or be released for whatever reason, I could share with our government and the families of those men who the prisoners were, because the North Vietnamese certainly weren't putting out the word. Memorizing all of the old French, German, Spanish vocabulary words that we could extract from our high school and college language days, and passing those and grammar rules through the walls. And when I returned and went to Berkeley for 2 years, pursuing a master's in political science, I achieved 2 years of college credit by exam for the French that I learned through the walls of Hanoi. One of my Air Force contemporaries there was a real godsend. He knew poetry. It seemed that when he was a youngster, his mother used to force him to learn a brand new poem to recite to the annual Thanksgiving family reunion every year, and he hated it. But she made him do it. I guess he wouldn't get any turkey for dinner or something, but he always did. But more amazingly, he retained so much of that poetry, and he began passing it through the walls to us. Classics such as Shakespeare's sonnets and the poems of Rudyard Kipling, Ballad of East and West, the poem If, Gunga Din. We memorized Alfred Noyes' The Highwayman, and when I was released, I had memorized, committed to memory, about 35 or 40 poems, some of them very long and epic, with dozens of stanzas. And we particularly appreciated the poems by Kipling, particularly for their masculine appeal, I think. It was interesting that a stanza from Kipling, poem If, was quoted yesterday. And I'd like to quote another one that meant so much to us. If you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve their term long after they are gone, when there's nothing left within you except the will that says to them, hold on, hold on. Well, as we began to develop this appreciation for poetry, we all tried our hand at composing poetry. And I say compose rather than wrote because we had no pencil and paper, and if you wanted to compose a poem, you just made it up line for line and memorized the lines and then the verses and so on. And I'll never forget my own first attempt at composing poetry. Sometimes to break up our usual rice diet, we had bread, and it would come in a little crust, kind of like a small French loaf. But you can be sure that wherever the flour for that bread was kept in those dungeon-like prisons of Wallow, there were bugs and weevils and lice and roaches and so on, so at least we had a little protein supplement in our bread when we got it. But I was sitting on my concrete slab one day, and I took a bite out of my bread, and I composed my first poem. I said, "Little weevil in my bread, I think I just bit off your head." Of course I had, and that poem went downhill after that. It didn't get any better. But as I was sitting there in the sweltering heat of a Hanoi summer, my body covered with heat rash, not knowing whether, when, or if I'd ever go home, I found myself laughing, and I thought, God, you must be going off your rocker, you know. But I wasn't. I was maintaining that sense of humor, that axiomatic sense of humor that is known to be found in American fighting men. And that was brought forth again later on in a part of Wallow Prison that we had named Heartbreak Hotel. And it was called Heartbreak Hotel because it was where you were usually taken after your initial interrogations, whether they lasted 2 weeks or 4 weeks or a month and a half. Heartbreak Hotel consisted of a small cell block of 8 cells, 4 rows on either side of a center passageway. And old cell number 8 had been converted into a shower. By that I mean a rusty pipe just ran up the wall and bent over at the top so the water could run on your head. Inevitably, every man would be taken to cell number 8 so he could bathe, and the guard would shove him in very brusquely and slam the door and say, "Wash." And you'd be left alone. And you'd reflect back over those previous weeks and feel about as low as the vermin that was scurrying across the decks of old cell number 8 there, because inevitably you were disappointed in yourself. No matter how you'd done, you hadn't been as tough as you thought you would be. And it was hard to accept. Well, you'd strip off the tattered remnants of your flight suit if you had that left, or maybe the ill-fitting shirt or shorts that some peasant might have loaned you on the way to Hanoi. Turn on the cold water of that shower and stand there and hang onto the pipe and let it run over your head. And pretty soon you'd look up, and there, at eye level, scratched indelibly by some American before you, were the words, "Smile, you're on candid camera." And you would, of course, and it made all the difference in the world, and you could turn yourself around. Keeping faith in that sense of humor, keeping faith in your ability to maintain your priorities and your sanity and your sense of values in an Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll world where people don't even use the same dictionary. Keeping faith in yourself to obey that American fighting man's code of conduct, those 6 articles which prescribe the behavior that is expected of us in those circumstances. Keeping faith in ourselves to minimize the net gain to the enemy. Faith in ourselves to be tough, to last, to endure for as long as necessary. Well, when I returned to America there in February of 1973, I looked around, and because of the changes, I saw such a lack of faith in ourselves as individual Americans, and still do to a certain extent. A lack of faith in ourselves to look around us and see the things that are wrong and still believe that we can make a difference in changing them, to make them right. A lack of faith in ourselves as individual citizens to still maintain control of our system and to contribute positively. A lack of faith in ourselves as Christians or as spiritual believers to believe that no matter how much we may falter, how we may sometimes fail and be disappointed in ourselves, that we can still bounce back, and to keep faith in our ability to do that. A lack of faith in ourselves to espouse our beliefs, whether they be patriotic or spiritual, and not be embarrassed about doing it. A lack of faith in ourselves to plant our feet somewhere and say, this is right and this is wrong, and by God, I know the difference. And not be swayed by the modes and fashions and styles of that particular day. Keeping faith in ourselves to live out, to gut out those prison-like aspects of our daily routine whereby we're not totally free, but we have to fulfill the consequences and responsibilities of the decisions that we've taken for ourselves back up the pike somewhere. And as much as we might wish things were different, or that we were somewhere else or someone else doing something else, it isn't to be. So without resorting to those crutches of booze or drugs or whatever, we gut it out. We hack it. Keeping faith in ourselves to do that as necessary. Keeping faith in my fellow man there in prison in Hanoi. Being sure, knowing for certain that every man in every cell, whether he be in contact and communication or not, was doing his very utmost to resist as you were, to obey that code of conduct as you were. But the Vietnamese realized that there was strength in unity, and they kept us separated for as long as they could. It was forbidden to even communicate or see another American. But that became our foremost challenge, to bring every man into our communication system and to persist with that communications. Now, we developed a technique to communicate which was the basis for all of our communicating, called tap code. And I'd like to share with you how that worked. Tap code was a means of tapping on the wall. Not body language, but I guess you'd call it knuckle language. And it was based upon a little matrix of 25 letters. We leave out the letter K of the alphabet because we can use a C instead of a K. And this 25-letter matrix was composed of 5 rows of 5 letters. So I had 5 rows and 5 columns of letters, with A through E across the top, F through J across the second row, and so on, with Z down in the lower right-hand corner. So that if I want to tap an A on the wall, I tap once because A is in the first row, and once because A is in the first column. B is in the first row, second column. C is in the first row, third column. F, second row, first column. And of course, Z. We developed our own shorthand, our own abbreviations, our own slang, and several times the Vietnamese tried to intercept messages tapped this way, and there was simply no way they could keep up with us. You'd call up the man next to you, naturally, and he'd respond, of course. And then you could spend several hours a day tapping on the wall, visiting with your neighbor, providing mutual strength and sustenance to each other. We tapped so much that we began to have calluses on our knuckles, and pretty soon the guards got wise. We'd just grab your hand and look and see if you had calluses, and sure enough, if you did, you were guilty and you'd be punished. So we began to tap with little pieces of metal and rocks and so on to spare ourselves at least that aspect of the punishment. You'd come back from an interrogation session and you want to pass a piece of hot news that you'd gained, and you'd get up on the wall and pass it along, and then in a few minutes put your ear to the wall, and the whole cell block would sound like an office full of professional secretaries pounding away on their typewriters. You'd spend hours with the man next to you, and you'd get to know him like your own brother, but you wouldn't get to see him or meet him or hug him for 4 or 5 or 6 years, maybe 7. We developed tap code further. Sometimes we were allowed to sweep out our cells with a bucket of water and a stiff bamboo broom, and so you'd slosh the water through the cell and take this broom and go down on the deck and say swish, 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 and the whole cell block could hear you, you know. And we also developed tap code in other ways. There was one small prison on the outskirts of Hanoi where every cell was a separate hut. There were no common walls, and communicating was very difficult. But like everywhere else in North Vietnam, the drinking water had to be boiled, and someone had to chop the wood to build the fire, to boil the water. And every morning, a new American was out there, chop, 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 chop. The whole countryside could hear, you know, but every American in every cell was being kept apprised, and the continuity of the resistance policy was being maintained. And we were drawing strength and sustenance and confidence from that communication. The final refinement, I think, to tap code was something we developed called vocal tap. And this is where we replace the taps by noises that we make as human beings. For example, so you could cough and hack and sniff and sputter all day long, you know. And communicating, taking it upon yourself as a sacred obligation to bring each new man into the communication system, taking any risk, risking the punishment if necessary, but making sure that every man was aboard. And you know, when the man in the cell next to you was down and hurting and they were really leaning on him hard, if you could just clear that little crack under your door to watch for the shadow of a guard and get to the wall long enough to tap GB, and that meant God bless. And he knew that also meant, be tough, babe, hang in there. I'm praying for you. And you were. And at night, when all was quiet, it was so comforting to hear the man next to you come up on the wall very softly and tap. GN, good night. GBA, God bless America. Keeping faith in our families so far away, realizing that for us, our existence in that vacuum-like place was very easy and our duty was very clear-cut. But realizing that for our families back home, facing the problems and trials and temptations of daily living in that complex world and society, it wasn't that easy. Being true, keeping faith, and in my case, that faith was more than fulfilled. Keeping faith in the Vietnamese as fellow human beings, hoping, realizing that they would show compassion when necessary, sympathy, mercy as necessary, and indeed I experienced several of those occasions. Keeping faith with our fellow Americans at home, not the least of which was our government and the policies of that government in the pursuit of the Vietnam War. And let me tell you that the entire time I was there, on a daily basis, my convictions in that cause grew because I was able to see and experience firsthand the alternative. Every single day for those 7 years, through the loudspeakers that were in every cell with no on-off or volume switch, through the reading material that was supplied by Hanoi Press, I heard everything that was bad about the United States of America. All that was negative, all that was sensational, all that we had the least to be proud of. We heard about the crime, the corruption, the riots, the demonstrations, the instability, the hurricanes, the forest fires, the details of the Manson murders, the Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King assassinations, all of the things that would make us feel sad and bad about our country. And sometimes after that overwhelming deluge of negative propaganda, the accumulative effect would begin to get to you, and you'd have to get a hold of yourself and say, hey, wait a minute, babe, don't believe all that junk. You're an American, you've been there, you know what your country's like. Keep faith in America. Keep faith. You'd have to reach way back into your past sometimes to the words that perhaps some high school history or civics teacher had told you, or maybe the words of a Boy Scout master, or your uncle who'd fought in World War II, to the things that they had told you about your country and why you could keep faith in the reasons to sacrifice and sometimes die for that country. Keeping faith in America there in Hanoi was not always that easy, but we did. And when I returned to America, and still on a daily basis, I open the morning newspaper or listen to the news radio on the way to work or the TV news, and you guessed it, what do we see? The bad, the sensational, everything that sells news, all that we have the least to be proud of. And sometimes with that overwhelming deluge of propaganda too, right here at home, it's difficult to keep from being sucked into that rut of cynicism and sarcasm about our country and about our system. It's hard to remember how it's worked for us so well, when in fact we live in the greatest democracy that's ever existed on the face of the earth. A democracy that provides for us as individuals the potential to reach any level we want as we please, depending upon our own ambition and energy. Freedom. As a nation, we've achieved so much in scientific fields, economy, medical. We have so many reasons to keep faith in America, so many reminders on a daily basis, not the least of which are the refugees that we see striving to get to the countries of the West, all the ones that harbor our kind of government, the ones that we share with our allies. We have a system that's endured for over 200 years, and there's got to be a reason for that. Some people said we wouldn't even get through the 70s, but of course we did. Keeping faith in God as well. In Hanoi, as I said at the outset, I prayed a lot. The first words that I saw scratched on a cell wall by another American were simply, God equals strength. And for me it worked. I was never alone. And every day, each man had his own spiritual routine, sometimes lasting for hours. But for sure on Sunday mornings, the senior man of each cell block would pass the church signal through the wall, wait a few minutes for it to circulate throughout the rest of the cell block, and then every man would stand in his cell and in some semblance of togetherness, we would recite the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag, the Lord's Prayer, sometimes the 23rd Psalm, dwelling upon that verse that says, "Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over." And we realized as we looked at the officers and guards around us that it was our cup that runneth over, not theirs, because someday we would go home. Even though we were behind those bars, we were still free, and they would have to stay there in that system of theirs for the rest of their lives. And it was our cup that runneth over. Easter of 1966, not very long after I was shot down, I was taken out of my cell one night, told to put on my long-sleeve shirt, down through the corridors of Wallow Prison, and into a very brightly lit interrogation room, a table with a blue cloth, a little teapot there with a dish of candy and cookies and teacups, and a large group of officers and guards standing around to the side. And seated across the table was a very old and venerable Vietnamese priest. His name was Father Jean-Baptiste Ho Tam Dien. It's one of a dying breed because, you know, they're not making any more priests in Vietnam, north or south. And he was there to hear my Easter confession and to give me communion. And as I sat down across from him, I could immediately see mirrored in the little rimless spectacles that he wore the hand signals of the officer behind me as he told him that it was his Christian duty to tell me that it was my Christian duty to make propaganda for the prison authorities, to write letters to my congressmen, to my senators, to my president, to the GIs in the South, telling them to bring this war to an end, to demonstrate, to protest. And he knew that he was being used, compromised. But he was fighting for his survival, just like I was. Well, that night he gave me a little plastic rosary with the beads. And I took that rosary back to my cell, which kind of surprised me because normally we weren't allowed to keep anything that wasn't specifically issued. And I had the rosary with me for several years. And I derived a great deal of comfort from it. Not just spiritual comfort, because I soon found that when I was being punished for whatever reason, and my legs were in those stocks at the foot of my slab, and my hands were cuffed behind me, and had been that way for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and I just didn't know how I was going to get through the next day or night. Using that little rosary as a key, I could open almost any pair of handcuffs that they could find to put on me. Honest to God. And in the middle of the night, the man next to me would be on his hands and knees with his face pressed against the deck, clearing through the crack under his door so that I could undo my cuffs and put my arms in front and lay back and get a little sleep or rest my shoulders. And he'd give me a danger thump on the wall when a guard was approaching. And I could sit back up and put my hands behind so that it would look like I was still cuffed when the guard opened the little peephole to check. And then in a couple of weeks, I'd be down on my hands and knees for him while he got out of his cuffs his way. One day I was pacing back and forth in my cell, and I had the rosary in my hand, and a particularly mean, vindictive guard came up, opened the little peephole, and demanded to see what I had in my hand. So I handed him the rosary, and he snatched it away. He already knew what it was. And while he was looking at the rosary, I asked him this question. I said, "Do you believe in God?" And he knew exactly what I had asked. And his answer was so poignant. He simply pointed the rank insignia on his shoulder, shook his head. And it was obvious that for him there simply wasn't room for Christ or Buddha or Muhammad or any other prophet and Ho Chi Minh. There wasn't room for Christianity or Buddhism or Mohammedanism and communism, for indeed those were his religion. And that would be all he would know. And it reminded me at that time how blessed we are as Americans to be free to worship or not worship as we see fit, to gather just like this and discuss it and not make a great political extravaganza out of it, having the content dictated to us. And when I returned to America in 1973, I was appalled at how little credit we gave to the spiritual aspects of our lives, how much we had forgotten how much spirit there is to the basis of our own society, of our own country. our loss of that awareness, our loss of the humility that goes with the belief in something so much more great, something more powerful than we as frail human beings. And how many reminders there are of that spirituality for us if we just look. A couple of years ago, while I was stationed in Washington, as I would jog at noon down the Monument Trail, passing the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, I would frequently stop and reread the tracts of the quotations of our founding fathers. And I was always struck by how frequently they referred to spiritual strength and spiritual guidance and divine providence. It's been there from the outset, you know. And every day, although we take it so much for granted, we still use money that says, "In God we trust." And when we pledge allegiance to our flag, we still say, "One nation, under God." And I've heard it said that so long as America can stay great, and by great I mean righteous, ethical, moral, humble, merciful, so long as America can stay great, good, America will stay great. And I really believe that. And there were a few men among me there in Hanoi who were espoused atheists or agnostics, their choice. They didn't have the practice in believing in something that they couldn't see or touch or smell. And they had a hard time keeping faith in themselves and in their fellow men, both in prison and at home, and in their country and its cause. And I don't think that was any accident. Keeping faith in God. Those four aspects of faith, faith in myself, faith in my fellow man, faith in my country, and faith in God, sustain me through that time and work for me every day. And I would suggest that they can help anyone on that same basis. That was the key to my survival. And at the outset I said, it wasn't just my experience, it was yours as well, in so many more ways than you may realize just now. And that was brought home to me when we came home. And I had friends, and sometimes strangers would come up and say, "Boy, I watched you guys on television, the way you came home, the things that you said when you got off those big airplanes at Clark Air Base in the Philippines. The things that you said like, we're honored to have had the opportunity to serve our country during adverse times. We're grateful to our Commander-in-Chief and to the people of our nation. God bless America." When you guys said those things, it made me feel so proud. I felt so good. Because you can be sure that if you had come home in those circumstances, whatever your role may have been in that whole experience, you would have come home the same way, you'd have met us the same way, you would have said the same words, because we all derive our strength from the same source. We're all of the same clay and spirit. And just as I was in your hearts and your prayers during all those years, you were there in Hanoi with me, giving me strength and sustenance all that time. For 7 years, the Vietnamese tried to break my spirit, my confidence, my faith, and they couldn't do that. And in great part, the reason is right here before me today. All of you, for your help, for your performance there in Hanoi with me. I'm very, very proud. And I'd like to say thank you. And God bless.
This is the end of Side 8. Side 7 is already queued up for your next listening.